A brand new CBS News article takes a look at former President Trump's endorsements in this year's midterm elections. Now, Mr. Trump is supporting nearly 130 candidates. And while many are doing well in the polls, some of those chosen don't look destined for victory, at least not yet. And that's raising some questions about the former president's power and influence over Republican Party voters. Yet, there are still a key number of races where candidates vie for Mr. Trump's blessing. CBS News political reporters Caitlin Huey-Burns and Adam Brewster are the authors of that very fine article I just briefly summarized. So, Caitlin, how does someone actually, in practical terms, vie for former President Trump's endorsement?
Hey, Major. Well, trips to Mar-a-Lago or Bedminster certainly don't hurt. We've seen lots of candidates and, go to visit Trump himself and ask for the endorsement. Federal Election Commission filings show that federal candidates for office and allied groups have spent over $750,000 at Trump's property. So that kind of goes to show the influence that is playing there. We've also seen several of these campaigns hire Trump World staffers for their own campaigns, hoping that gives them some kind of access, but also some insight into courting the Trump base as well. And we've also seen, according to people that we've talked to who have talked to the president, say that what the former president is looking at in making these endorsements is really focusing on the candidates' polling, the candidates' fundraising, what their campaign organization looks like. He wants to make sure that they are fighting for the things that he had fought for, and he's also paying very close attention to debates. So a lot of these candidates know that. A lot of these candidates know what the former president is looking for. So those are the kinds of things that they are trying to highlight in vying for his endorsement.
And Caitlin, I've also heard that among the other things the former president does is he checks their track record. Have they ever said anything negative or even remotely negative about the former president? If so, they're in a category that's different and they have to work even harder. Is that true?
That's right, Major. This is a former president who, as we know, holds grievances and remembers them. Those around him also remember them. And so that has been interesting to watch some of the evolution of some of these candidates that had said bad things about Trump in the past, how they've tried to recalibrate in order to curry his favor. But he hasn't, for some of those candidates, that hasn't been enough to get his endorsement yet.
Adam, what is the value politically of a Trump endorsement, and is that political value measurement viewed differently than it was, say, 6 months ago?
Certainly, I think major operatives and consultants and people who work in this world view it differently than when Trump was in the White House, right? Obviously, who's working on multiple campaigns, right, said, hey, getting the Trump endorsement is a good day for you. This is a guy who has his thumb on the pulse of the grassroots of the party and has a big sway over the grassroots of the party. But getting that in and of itself is not going to necessarily make you the next senator, governor, or congressman, whatever office you may be running for. It's also how campaigns utilize that. It can come with, perhaps a bit of a fundraising bump, and it will play out differently in different races. Take a look at North Carolina, for example. We've talked about the Senate race there. Trump endorsed Representative Ted Budd almost a year ago, last June. He is still in a very tough primary against former North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory. And then you look at Ohio, where you still have 4 serious candidates all sort of jockeying to be seen or vying for that Trump endorsement in the hopes that, hey, that may lift them to 26% or a number that just puts them over the edge that they need to win in a crowded primary. So, even in races where Trump hasn't weighed in, we've seen candidates sort of saying, I'm the most America first, or I'm the most pro-MAGA or the most pro-Trump, in a way to perhaps sort of prime voters and win them over, maybe even before the former president weighs in. So that sort of shows, too, the sway that he has over a large base of the party, that so many candidates are trying to speak and align themselves with him, even if he hasn't necessarily thrown his weight behind them.
Caitlin, Adam took us to North Carolina and Ohio. I'm also thinking Alabama, Pennsylvania. How is this playing out in places that Adam didn't describe, meaning North Carolina or Ohio?
Well, Major, what happened in Alabama is actually informing the former president's thinking when it comes to some of these other races where he hasn't endorsed. So remember in Alabama last week, he withdrew his endorsement of Congressman Mo Brooks, who was a longtime ally of the former president. Trump said in his statement withdrawing the endorsement that Brooks was, saying that we need to move forward from 2020 and not dwell on the past. But really, Trump was looking at the polling, and people that we've talked to in the state said that Mo Brooks was behind in polling. He wasn't going to be able to win that primary. As we know, Trump is very reluctant to pick people who are not going to win. He wants to preserve a track record there. So what happened there is making him a bit more cautious in terms of considering other candidates in some of these other high-profile races, at least according to someone that we talked to who was familiar with the former president's thinking. So take a place like Ohio, where you have all of those candidates vying for the endorsement, wanting Trump to weigh in. Remember, early voting starts in that state for that primary next week. So candidates there are very eager for the president to make a decision. You also have open races in Missouri. You have an open race in Pennsylvania. These are places where the Republicans, in order to win the primary, they feel like having the endorsement from Trump can help them inch ahead. People that we've talked to have said that they've seen in polling candidates get a bump, but again, it's up to the candidates to capitalize on that endorsement. But in a place like Ohio, for example, which will really be that first test of Trump's strength if he does indeed decide to endorse, those are the dynamics at play.
So, Adam, as you well know, Trump world can be defined largely, meaning in a very all-encompassing, like I'm for Trump and I like him and I did something once at a rally or something, or very small, people who are in an inner circle. And it's clear that there are some divisions even within those really tight concentric circles of Trump world, meaning people who are very close to Trump inside the White House are working for candidates either hasn't endorsed or has endorsed somebody else. How are those playing out?
Right. We've seen some household names from the Trump era, be it Corey Lewandowski or Kellyanne Conway, getting involved in races, and other advisors who some of our viewers at home may be less familiar with. But what this means is you have people who are varying degrees of closeness to the former president, and in terms of how close they are with him today and how close they were with him perhaps when he was in office. But they're on opposite sides on some of these races, and that means that, look, having a former Trump staffer, as Caitlin said, perhaps gives you some access to the former president, gives you some insights into his thinking, may also be a way to tap into some of the strategies that the former president used to communicate with base Republican voters and shape some of the messaging. But it doesn't appear that hiring these staffers in and of themselves necessarily makes any difference. We've also seen former Trump officials get out involved and start to back candidates themselves. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, for example, his former press secretary, who's running for governor of Arkansas, is going to be campaigning with Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania tonight, along with Hope Hicks, former White House communications aide. And, we've seen all of these people out on the trail trying to, again, as I talked about, gin up some of those ties to Trump, right? Even if he doesn't weigh in on some of these races. That's a way that candidates are trying to distinguish themselves and say, hey, I'm more pro-Trump than these other candidates, because on a lot of these issues, these Republicans are singing from the same songbook. So they're looking for ways to distinguish themselves in any way that they can.
One truism in politics, former President Trump notwithstanding, endorsements matter, but ultimately voters decide. Caitlin, Huey-Burns, and Adam Brewster, we thank you.